Welcome to the Determinetruth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We are in episode 3 of 1 Thessalonians and doing it in a different kind of way. We're giving overviews and tackling some issues that you might have taken for granted and saying there is a different way to understand these passages, but not just for the sake of finding a different way, but is this different way the actual way that Paul intended them to be understood? And that's our question. If Paul were doing this podcast, how awesome would that be if Paul was a guest on the podcast?
He'd have to get in line.
He'd have to get...
You have to get in line.
We'll let you on, Paul.
Experts.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Paul, we need an expert on Paul's letters, and I wish we could get one.
Does
but
he
maybe
have a PhD?
He doesn't.
He doesn't. Who's Paul?
He just has a thorn in the side. But that's the goal. If Paul was on the podcast and he was saying, oh, this is what I meant, that's what we're trying to do. We're not just trying to find an alternate explanation. That's what we're looking at.
We want to be faithful to the text. Absolutely.
Exactly. We'll be primarily in chapters 3 and somewhat in chapter 4, not getting into the only section of chapter 4 that most people want to know about. That will probably be next week or a couple weeks later.
That'll be 5 weeks from now.
Yeah, because we're going to do some extra stuff. Yeah. So
that's right.
So anyway, where do we want to start at today when we look at chapters 3 and the first part of 4?
Well, let me ask you a question, and you may know the answer. You may not. I'm sure if you read my notes or looked at my notes or not. What was the sin of Sodom?
So I see the reference of Ezekiel 16. According to Ezekiel 16, if I'm remembering correctly, it's not having hospitality, not showing hospitality.
Okay. What was your inclination to answer the question? What do most people answer the question?
Most people, if you're going on a Genesis account, especially from an evangelical tradition, the sin of Sodom is going to be homosexuality.
Exactly.
I mean, call it sodomy, yeah.
Ezekiel 16.
Yeah. Isn't that what it says? Does it say hospitality or they'd use a different word?
It's not quite hospitality.
That's the idea.
It's a little bit more specific than that. So here we go. It says, verse 44, behold, everyone who quotes this proverb will quote this proverb concerning you, like mother, like daughter. You are the daughter of your mother, who loathed her husband. You are the sister of your sisters, who loathed their husbands and children. Your mother was a Hittite, and your father was an Amorite. I just love that. Your mother was a Hittite, and your father was an Amorite. Now, your older sister lived in Samaria. That's the northern kingdom of Israel, who lives north of you with her daughters. And your younger sister, who lives south of you, is Sodom with her daughters. So he's speaking to Israel, or he's speaking to Judah. This is Ezekiel. And he's like, look, your older sister is Samaria, the northern kingdom of Israel, and that doesn't exist any longer. They were sent away for idolatry. Verse 47, yet you have not merely walked in their ways or done according to their abominations, but as if that were too little, you acted more corruptly in all your conduct than they. As I live, declares the Lord, Sodom, your sister, and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and the needy. Whoa.
Yeah.
And then you go, I look at this, Vinnie, and I just can't think about the American church and go, how does this not apply? So what we want to do in this is we're going to look at the topic of Paul's statements in 1 and 2 Thessalonians. If a man will not work, he shall not eat. You can't be lazy, which gave rise to this Puritan work ethic of saying every man has to work, every person has to work. And if you are not willing to work, we're not going to care and provide for you, which I'm going to suggest, and we may have said this on our introductory episode, that's a misreading of what was happening at Thessalonica. The text really trying to say, which that's obviously our goal.
Yes.
And how does it apply for today? And then what we're going to do in the next couple episodes after this is we're going to talk, what does the Bible actually say about the poor and about caring for the poor and about poverty? What are the causes of poverty? What contributes to it? So we'll talk about American culture and American context, poor and poverty, and the whole biblical story, because what we've done, I believe, is we've taken 1 Thessalonians, I think misreading it, and have adopted a social policy and even a political policy, we won't get into the political part too much, to say we don't give handouts in the church because, and I think that's fundamentally undermines what the scripture says, and it's actually derives from misreading in 1 Thessalonians.
Sure. I want to interject with one quick off-ramp because I think if people are listening to that last section that we were talking about, they're going to ask a question. I'm just addressing what some people are going to be asking about. The Ezekiel passage is specifically applying the Sodom experience and saying this was the issue. They're saying that was the problem that was happening there. Would it be fair, though, to say, because you read in Jude 1, it talks about Sodom and Gomorrah, and the issue there was sexual immorality and perversion. There's different ways to looking at what was happening in Sodom. And so we could say, okay,
Yeah.
if you want to look at the sexual issues that were happening in Sodom, yeah, we could look at how Jude approached that in one way. However, that shouldn't take away from what Ezekiel is doing. And I think especially from an evangelical fundamentalist, more fundamentalist, or even just a strong conservative ethic, we want to say, no, it only had to do with sexual immorality. And it's no, let's take Ezekiel and say he wasn't applying sex at all to there. It was this other thing. And that needs to be equally as valid when we're looking at the Sodom
They were guilty
spirits.
of all of the above, right?
Yeah. And that's one thing that we don't do. We only want to look at the sexual side of things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Hey, let's also clarify this too. And we'll say this maybe a couple times as we go. And I'll say this for myself, and you can add in whatever you want.
Yeah.
I am not a Democrat. I am not a Republican.
Amen.
I am not a libertarian.
Yep.
What are other parts? I don't even know what the other parts are.
I'm politically homeless.
Yeah. I believe that Jesus' kingdom and Jesus' politics transcends all of that. I'm not a socialist. I'm not a communist. I'm not a
Capitalist.
Capitalist. I live in a capitalist society. I said this on the Revelation Revealed series. I live in a capitalist society. So therefore, great. I participate in the democratic process. Okay, great. But we're not espousing any of that.
No.
If it sounds like that, that's how it might be applied in the modern world, but that's not what Jesus is getting at. It transcends all that. The reality is that government handouts have problems in any system run by humanity,
Any system.
including the church, is going to be problematic because sin, greed, corruption are going to be part of the process. And so there's not a perfect system out there. We as Christians, I think, are called to critique them all. And our concern, I think, on these episodes is to simply say, what's the scripture saying? And then we have to figure out what that looks like in our individual lives, as well as what that looks like in our social, political context.
And the beauty of not being tied or tethered to a political system or party is you don't have to worry about how to fit the Bible into that. Because that's where I was at for years. It's okay, this is what I think the Bible's saying, but this is where I'm at. This is my political convictions. So how can I make sure that I expound on this in a way that fits this system? And is there a way I need to get away with it? I honestly, I don't give a hoot how this might play on the left or the right. This is just what the Bible's saying, and I live in these systems. If you are saying, man, this sounds liberal or conservative or whatever, don't project your stuff onto us. That's literally the furthest thing from what I think is going on. At least for me, I just don't care about that stuff. I care. It just doesn't matter when it comes to figuring out what the scripture's saying.
Yeah. All right. Excellent.
Yeah. So then when we're looking at this, going back now to the Thessalonians idea of not working means you don't get to eat, and that almost proverbial saying that we use constantly. It's not even like a Christian saying. It's almost into the market, be a good Samaritan. It's in the marketplace of ideas. Everyone just knows if you don't work, you don't eat. And most people might not know that's actually a biblical phrase. So part of what's happening here is Paul is taking somewhat of an Old Testament idea. And the Old Testament idea is that God is sovereign over all things.
Right.
He's the one who provides. And that's the background of things. It's not coming from a pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You're born to do whatever you're going to do, and you can make good decisions or you can make bad decisions. It's tough. It's difficult when you take a theological concept and import it on a secular society. You're not going to have the same motivation from people.
Yeah. And what's happening in Thessalonica is the fact that some of the Christians had, because that's where they came from, we're looking at the God-fearers, had been working with leading officials and leading individuals, honorable people, the wealthy in the city, the elite in the city, and had gotten benefits and blessings from that, and therefore didn't do menial labor. That was their job. That was their work. They weren't not working. They were benefiting from the whole system of patronage. And Paul's answer is, but to do that, you have to compromise who God is, because you have to give allegiance to their gods. We'll go over all this in a few minutes. And Paul's answer is, why don't you stop and trust in the Lord who provides? The whole biblical ideal is that in the Old Testament world, you didn't own the land. God is the owner of the land.
Yes.
You're just simply tenants on that land.
That's why you can't
and
sell
that
it.
God will, that's exactly right. And God will provide you from that land for your sustenance. So you don't have to worry about acquiring more land or worry about acquiring this or working 7 days a week. God's going to provide for you so that you have a sabbatical year where even the land remains fallow. So one of the questions I would even almost start with by saying is, how much do we as Christians today, especially in the West, get up and say, hey, God, truly today, I need you to give me my daily bread. We actually make dependence upon God part of our way of living. I think we just assume. I think we just live as though I'm okay, which reminds me of the church in Laodicea. I'm well, I have need of nothing. And Jesus' response is, you don't know that you're naked, poor, pitiable, blind, and naked. Wait a minute.
But isn't this even the idea of the Sabbath to begin with, which that goes into the Puritan work ethic? I know I've read many Protestant puritanical thinkers that say the work week shouldn't be 5 days. It should be 6 days, and we should only have one day off, and we're meant to work. We're designed to work, and God designed it so we only need one day off. And wasn't the point of the Sabbath to say, no, you take a rest. This is one of the points. You take a rest because you're going to depend on God for that day, because you can't just say, we're just going to pull from the refrigerator in the pantry and just eat whatever we have at home. If I'm not working today, how am I going to get food to work? Like I need to work. I need to actually gain I need to rely on God that Sabbath to say, where's my food coming from?
Okay. I think that actually, I understand why you're saying that. And that's just the way we've been raised to think. I think that actually it leads to abuse, spiritual abuse in the church. The Sabbath provision of the Old Testament, and we'll look at this maybe in one of the next couple episodes. The Sabbath provision in the Old Testament was, don't do what they did to you in Egypt. Give your workers a day off. Don't work them 7 days a week. It says explicitly, because you were slaves in Egypt. So the 10 Commandments are in Exodus and they're in Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
In both Exodus and Deuteronomy, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, they both begin with, remember, you were slaves in Egypt, before they even begin the 10 Commandments. When it gets to the Sabbath provision in Deuteronomy, it actually adds, and you were slaves in Egypt. The whole idea of that is, you know what it's like to be forced to work 7 days a week for your provision. Okay. We've taken that to go, oh, you're supposed to rest and rely upon God, which totally makes sense.
Sure.
So when I was pastoring in Bakersfield, California, that's the heart of agricultural land. Some of the laborers would have seasonal work when it's harvest season. And that harvest season is 7 days a week. And if they don't work 7 days a week, they don't have a job. And if they don't work 7 days a week for that 1 month period of time, they don't make enough living to survive the rest of the year. They have to work to provide for their needs. And I think what in Jesus, in Mark 2, and I think we might be discussing this again later on. In Mark 2, the disciples are walking through the field and they're plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees say, why are you doing what's not lawful? The normal Christian response is, Jesus' answer was, I don't agree with your definition of the Sabbath. That's not working. Jesus never says that. He never says your interpretation of the Sabbath is wrong. He says they're hungry. The reason why they're picking heads of grain on the Sabbath is because they're hungry. Because he applies it to what did David do when he came home from the war? He went into the temple and ate the bread that only belonged to the priests. Why did they do it? Because they were hungry. They did what was not lawful because they were hungry. And Jesus' answer is, they're plucking heads of grain because they're hungry. So I think the idea that the poor need to work on the Sabbath day because they need to work so they can eat, that's totally sufficient. That's totally fine. I think what the Sabbath is doing is saying, don't abuse people. So if you covet, you steal from somebody else, and now they have less and maybe not enough to survive. The whole idea of that is predicated upon being abused and I think we've read that the other way around and go, and think of it this way. That message of don't work on the Sabbath day and trust God is really meaningless to the wealthy because they don't have to trust God. They got a pantry full of food. But the poor, they have to trust on God? No, we've got that upside down.
No, this is good. So part of it is just even clearing away misnomers so we can understand the Thessalonians passage, because we've constructed this whole, I'm even thinking the idea of not coveting. How do we look at the law from a Western Christian perspective? Don't covet. It's always, because I need to guard my own heart. I need to pay attention to what's going on with me, which is true. That's not a bad statement. But I've never thought about because of what the other person is not going to have.
And think about this and go one step further. Who's the primary example in the Old Testament story of coveting and then murdering?
David.
David. Right?
Yeah.
And the law was meant to protect Uriah from David. Because here's the deal. You covet David's wife, you're dead.
Coveting, murder, and adultery.
Yeah. So you covet David's wife, you're dead. If you kill David's son, you're dead. If you do anything against the king, or Naboth, Ahab says, hey, let me have your vineyard. I can't sell you my ancestral lands. Lord forbid, he says. And the Lord does forbid, because it's not your land to sell. But guess what happens? Ahab covets his land and steals it, and even has Naboth murdered. David covets Bathsheba and steals her. I think he rapes her.
I agree.
Whether how much complicity she had or not. She was from a well-to-do family, so she had some privilege, but I don't think she had much say when the king calls her into the bedroom. And then he has Uriah murdered. The laws were meant to protect people like that from David, because the kings don't need laws themselves, because they'll impose justice themselves. So the people who need a Sabbath rest are the slaves in Egypt. It's the people who need to be told to give them the Sabbath rest are the business owners. So we flipped the Sabbath upside down because the business owners, I'll just take a day off. Yeah, but your employees actually need to work today.
Wow.
I think and then the other thing I would add to that, I guess we're getting into the next, and I wrote a blog on this back in June of 2025. I want to say it's June of 20, and maybe May or June of 2025. It's about the widow's mite.
Oh, okay.
Because I was talking about the big, beautiful Bill Act that Trump was trying to have passed and eventually did get passed in June and July of 2025. And it was this act that was going to give billions of dollars of tax cuts to the wealthy, and it was going to take away resources for the poor. And I'm like, what would Jesus think about this? Let's just talk about this for a second. And I know this gets into all kinds of political stuff. And I said, and I gave the story of the widow's mite. And I'll tell it now briefly, and we'll tell it maybe in a couple episodes from now. This widow goes and she gives 2 small copper coins, which is not enough for a loaf of bread. And we read that story and go, oh, Jesus is praising her for her faithfulness because he said this woman gave more than all the others, even though they were rich. Because he says he saw many rich people putting money in the treasury. He saw this poor widow, and he says she gave more than all the others. Jesus is praising her. Pastors use this as a sermon topic to say, you need to give sacrificially. And that's not what Jesus was doing. He was condemning the leaders for making her give. That woman didn't have enough money to buy a loaf of bread, and now she has nothing. You think Jesus is pleased with her giving? How's she going to eat? My voice is racing, I know, I'm sorry. But Jesus was furious with it. And if you look at the context of Mark 12, and if you look at the context of Luke 21, where that passage occurs, it's clear, and I'll save it for another episode. Jesus is condemning the religious leaders. He's not praising the woman for giving. And the way we preach this sermon is, if you make $30,000 a year, you give $10,000. That's sacrificial. I know, $3,000, 10%. That's sacrificial living. That's great. You're taking food off their table. If you make $30,000 a year, you're taking food off the table of that family. If you make $400,000 a year and you give 10%, you're not taking anything off the table. We can't really do that excursion in Paris, guys. Yep. Seriously, you're not giving sacrificially when you give 10% and you make $400,000. Yet we preach sacrificial giving, and it only burdens the poor. Yeah. What are we doing? This is the antithesis of Jesus and the gospel, and we'll flesh all that out in the next couple episodes.
Okay. Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob, Danny, and myself do on a weekly basis in our online Bible studies, live streams, and our coaching for pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters who get special behind-the-scenes access, but we can only do this with the generous support from those of you who can afford to give. So if you'd prayerfully consider supporting us with a fully tax-deductible donation, with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to Determinetruth.com and click on the Give tab, or find the link in today's show notes. Thanks. So
that's good.
Where do we want to go for now?
Let me review briefly just to set the context of this conversation first. So we know the story in Acts 17. Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke all enter the city of Thessalonica. It's a wealthy city. That's one of the keys to understanding this context. Very rich in resources. It was a free city in the Roman Empire. So it was not part of the Roman Empire officially, but Rome allowed it to be free. Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke stayed 3 Sabbath days, and then they were forced out, so 15 days or whatever, forced out. The church was heavily persecuted. They apparently had a lot of end times, the world's gonna, Jesus' return, and their suffering and persecution was part of that. And we'll talk about the end times in a few episodes from now as well. So Paul flees, goes to Berea, then makes his way down to Athens and eventually into Corinth. This becomes probably the second and third letters that Paul writes. And he writes because how are they doing? I can't go back there. So finally, Timothy goes back and comes back with Paul with a good report. They're doing well despite their persecution. So Paul writes these 2 letters in a very short span of time to address the issue that we're going to talk about today. I think in large part, that's why the second letter was written. They were accusing Paul because he fled. So people in the city were accusing Paul of not being on the up and up, in it for the money, coming in and preaching and then leaving too quickly, challenging his character. And Paul's like, you know what I did? I work with my hands. And then the issue of some people are taking and not contributing to the community because their sustenance is being provided for by these benefactors, by these patrons. And so that becomes the big issues. I hope that frames the conversation. Obviously, sexual immorality is in there. Let's start by looking at 1 Thessalonians 3, verses 11 through 13. It's actually the last 3 verses of chapter 3. And then we'll read in a second the first 2 verses of chapter 4, and then we'll read a few more verses as well. So 1 Thessalonians 3, 11 through 13.
Okay. Now may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus direct our way to you, and may the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another and for all, just as we abound in love for you. And may he so strengthen your hearts in holiness that you may be blameless before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his saints.
Okay, so you see in there the indication of, hey, I want you to be blameless in holiness when Jesus returns. So there's a heavy expectation for the return of Jesus, and it's an exhortation to them. What preceded this was, hey, we heard about your persecutions, your sufferings. That's great. Keep enduring. That's great. Oh, and by the way, I was working. I did all these things. I'm on the up, and I was really worried about you. But finally, Timothy's come. This is chapter 3, verse 6. He's come with a good report. Wow, thank goodness. Now, let me respond to a couple issues here. May our God, and it's prefaced with these 3 verses. May God direct you that you can increase and abound for love for one another and for everyone, so that you can be blameless in holiness at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that's your context there. And then I think if you want to read verses 1 and 2.
Finally, brothers and sisters, we ask and urge you in the Lord Jesus that as you learn from us how you ought to live and to please God, as in fact you are doing, you should do so more and more. For you know what instructions we gave you through the Lord Jesus.
So this becomes the key introduction. Here we go. Finally, therefore, brothers, depending on how you translate that. And the word, my translation says finally then, brothers, but the Greek it's that it's therefore. And there's that vocative, adelphoi. So finally, therefore, brother, we request and we exhort you. Oh, wow, that's strong language. In the Lord Jesus Christ. And ultimately, it's that you live a life worthy of the calling, that you learn how you ought to walk and please God, just as you actually do, but I want you to excel more and more. So it's a positive letter. It's correction, but notice that correction is, I know you're doing this. I just want you to do better. It's a nice way of saying it. So let's skip down now to verses 9 through 12 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4.
Now, concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anyone write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. And indeed, you do love all the brothers and sisters throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, beloved, to do so more and more, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we directed you, so that you may behave properly towards outsiders and be dependent on no one. You know what I love about this part of the passage? Talk about encouragement. And it reminds me of, there's times I have an 8-year-old now where I need to do stuff for him or with him. But it's so cool with kids where you start getting them to be at the age where it's like, you got this. You actually don't need me to do this anymore. But they think they need you still, but they don't have that confidence to do it. And like, I'm getting to that age with Mateo where it's like, buddy, you don't need me.
You're getting that age, or he's getting
personally, that age? I'm getting that age as a 46-year-old man.
I just want to clarify.
I know we are getting to that age where it's like, buddy, you don't need me. You could actually just do this by yourself, but you think you need me, but you don't need me anymore. And that's just that, I don't know, coming from a father, I'm just reading this passage in a different kind of way. Just the fatherly encouragement that Paul is giving, not just, I want you to be able to do this, but it's like, you got this. Just keep doing better at it, but you got this.
Yeah. Well, once they realize that they don't need you anymore,
that's the worst.
It sucks.
Yeah.
It just sucks. I agree. Yeah. Shayla, why didn't we have more kids?
I was just going to say that at least you had 4 times to do that. Like for us, it's like, dude, I'm one and done on this thing.
That was the great thing. Mackenzie's 7 years younger than Jared.
So you figured it all out.
Boys.
Yeah.
We had 3 boys, and then we missed all that. They're growing up, and now we get to do it all over again. It was so cool when we had all those stages there. And now Mackenzie's 22. And, that's really, So getting old is not fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we go. So it's possible here, by the way, Vinnie, that Paul is responding to a letter that they got from him or some kind of correspondence from him. Maybe Timothy comes with words saying, hey, these are the issues. So we know how in 1 Corinthians, Paul is literally responding to a letter that they wrote. Now concerning the matters you wrote about. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1, and then you see it in verse 8, chapter 8, verse 1, and chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians. It doesn't come across in our translations, but if you're looking at the Greek, Vinnie, peri, in the chapter 4, verse 9, that preposition, then you see it again in chapter 4, verse 13, and then in chapter 5, verse 1. And that might be an indication, okay, about this and about this, let me remind you of this. Okay, as for the love of the brothers, that was clearly an issue. One brought this up, maybe Timothy. Here's what's going on. I know you're doing okay, but there were some that were not. And I think that's really what's going on. So verse 11, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, and to attend to your own business and to work with your hands, just as we can manage it. So here's this exhortation. We exhort you, brothers, excel still more, and then make it your ambition. And then the Greek, by the way, Vinnie, has 3 infinitives. To lead a quiet life, to attend to your own business, this is verse 11, and then to work with your hands. So that's the exhortation that Paul's given.
Once again, let's do some more background information. Thessalonica, as you elitist ivory towers would say. What was the situation there that is probably prompting Paul's words here?
So when Paul says to work with your hands, he's not talking about people that were not working, that need to go get a job. He's saying you need to get independence from these patrons because the patrons are providing all that you need. Instead, if you get independence from them, you can go work with me in the shops downtown as a laborer. That's the context. So the context is patronage. So here's a quote from Richard Horsley. This is a book actually called You Shall Not Bow Down or Worship Them, I think is the title of the book. It's a really interesting book. He says, and I'm just going to go through this quote, but comment on it, so it won't be an actual literal quote. He says, it's difficult to imagine that the members of the Thessalonian assembly, under severe persecution, could maintain even a subsistence economic livelihood. The Christians are going to struggle to survive. Many, if not most people in the cities, were directly or indirectly dependent upon the wealthy and are powerful in some way. It seems that Paul's exhortations to abound in love for one another, chapter 3, verse 12, and to love all the Christians, clearly addressed to the whole community, suggests that they aid one another economically, that you need to care for one another. So when he says in chapter 4, which we haven't looked at yet, to live quietly and mind your own affairs, it suggests keeping some separation from others in the city. In the admonition in chapter 4, to work with your hands and be dependent upon no one, chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. And especially chapter 5, to do good to one another, verse 15, implies some sort of care, taking care of one another economically. This love and mutual aid, moreover, is not just a desirable value that Paul recommends, but given the persecutions that they were undergoing, the doing good to one another and abounding in love for one another refers to measures of concrete mutual aid, practices in which they are already engaged, and that he urges them to continue.
So here's my question, though, in terms of that's helping to shape the Roman idea of patronage. But if I'm reading this and even going back, if I'm reading Thessalonians, I'm going back to the way you started this was Paul's encouraging them to not depend on these pagan patrons who are supporting them.
Yeah.
Why would it be inappropriate to, even I'm thinking in an American context, to say, then don't depend on the American government for sustenance?
So it's a little different. One is the people that are relying upon the American government often have no options. They have no other choice. They have no hope. So first thing is, we're not talking about the dirt poor. Okay. So a patron, and if you're familiar with like golf and you watch the Masters, the famous golf tournament, they call the people that come the spectators, the patron, which actually is a misuse of the word. Yeah. The patron was the wealthy benefactor, the wealthy one. The clients were the people that were underneath the patrons and benefiting.
We do the same thing with restaurants. Like I go to a restaurant, I'm a patron at this restaurant. Yeah, we do the same thing.
Yeah, you're not. You're a client of the restaurant. And so that's confusing.
In the Roman
patrons were the wealthy benefactors. The clients were the people that benefited from them. Now, the wealthy benefactors, what they get out of this is they get honor and prestige. Because look at all the clients that I have. Look at all the people that do my work for me. They do my bidding. They speak up on my behalf. They tell everybody how great I am. They laud me. That is not going to work if they're all poor peasants. So the clients, you're not going to pick from the poor peasants. You're going to pick from what we would call middle class, but there really is no middle class. You're going to take from people that have some repute, that have some level of respect. They're still somebody. They're not nobodies. And what they're going to do is they're going to say, hey, why don't you become my client? And now you can leave your day laborer job or your day-to-day job, and you can work for me. Okay. So there's this dependence upon, so that it's what we would call middle class, but it's not really middle class. It's like upper poor, if there's such a thing. The system of patronage then was this, it's a hierarchical system in which the wealthy and the powerful are providing support, protection, and favors to these clients, the less wealthy, upper poor people, if I can say it that way. Yeah. Now, this is the way Roman society worked. And the idea in the Roman world was the emperor is the supreme patron. He was even called the Patronus of the entire empire. That almost sounds like Harry Potter. Yeah. Harry Potter. Patronus legathos. Something appears. A frog. Okay, sorry. But I digress.
I don't watch that witchcraft.
I have to watch it 5 times because I fall asleep.
Yeah.
That's another story. The empire is built on this system. Now, the local patrons then, the elites in the city, they would give gifts. They would give grain. They give jobs. They would also give public games to everybody in the community. They might host a banquet for the entire community, a festivity for the entire community. Mm-hmm. And that might be like the poor people. That might be the one time that they actually eat meat, because you go to these festivities that the patrons are providing for everybody in this city. But you are his client. So now you're working this festival and you get a little bit more honor than everybody else is just happy to have a meal because you're somebody at this festivity, even though you're really a nobody. You're just kind of sucking up to this person there. So the patrons get loyalty, they get honor, and then they get public jobs. They might be mayors or city officials because they got enough of a popular vote, enough people following them to get them in positions of power. And obviously they're landowners, they own all the land, and they get wealth from that as well. The clients would get a lot more of a lax job. They get more security. I know where my food's going to come from tomorrow because my patron's going to provide it. I don't have to worry about if I'm a fisherman, am I going to catch any fish tomorrow? I know where I'm getting my food from tomorrow because my patron has food. So you get a little security. You get a little bit of prestige. You get a little bit of lax. You don't have to work as hard. You're not a day laborer. You're not out in the fields pulling weeds, or you're not out in the fields doing whatever it is and cutting grapes or whatever it might be. You're just walking around town and giving him honor and things like that. Here's the catch. And this is where Paul had a problem with it. And that's this. You also had to give him honor to his gods and to his religion and to his politics. You had to buy into the whole package, social, economic, religious, political. And Paul said, you can't do that because you have another Lord, and that's Jesus. And you also had to, we see this in politics today, by the way. Your politician friend does something bad, what do? You cover up for him. You say, I had this just the other day. I wrote a blog that I think that came out this morning as we're recording this in the first week of August, 2025. And the blog is basically, people in Gaza are starving, and we're debating on whose fault it is. Let's stop debating whose fault it is, and let's get them food. But somebody else said to a post the other day, it's all Hamas's fault. You just bought the propaganda of the empire. I'm not saying Hamas isn't at fault. I'm saying that's way too simple. Hamas is at fault when, Israel's not letting food in. And when they are letting food in, they're only giving 4 distribution sites. Vinnie, it's 5 miles wide by 25 miles long. 4 distribution sites means how far do you have to go to get food? You might have to walk 5 miles. And guess what? That's through a firing zone. I think it's 50 people got killed yesterday trying to get food. Okay. That's not all on Hamas. Okay. So what you do is you cover for that political candidate. You cover for that political person or for that empire or whatever it is, because that's where your allegiance is. And Paul comes along and says, Jesus won't let you do that. You got to cut ties with that and go work with your hands. They weren't not working. They were getting money from a system that Paul says you can't participate in that system.
So I'm curious, because most of us aren't going to be familiar with the idea of patronism in the first century Roman world. But a lot of what you're describing is going to sound like what many of us might be familiar with. And this is where I'd be interested to hear your compare and contrast. Like in medieval history, the idea of feudalism, a lot of this sounds like that, where you have this wealthy landowner and then they'll hire on what we would know as knights and things like that to care for the lands and protect for that. And then they get certain benefits. Are there any connections between feudalism of the Middle Ages and what we're seeing in patronism?
So I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form. I'm not even an expert on patronage, but I'm not an expert in medieval feudalism.
It just sounds like that concept from what I know about it.
It sounds very similar. Here's the question I would ask, and I don't know if you know the answer or someone else knows the answer, and that is, how much of this was politically motivated? Because the idea of patronage was politically motivated. It was to give you more political esteem, to give you more political privilege, to give you more power. Whereas in feudalism, it was basically to keep you under my thumb to make sure that you work and provide for my well-being.
Interesting. Okay. I think feudalism is more of maintaining control of your property.
Yeah.
And maybe expanding your own little local empire rather than doing it in a way that's self-serving just for yourself to prop yourself. Even in seminary, we didn't study patronism.
I know.
But we study feudalism when you study medieval history.
Yeah. No, this is a critical part of the New Testament story.
Yeah.
Because this is what Jesus was getting at a little bit. And it's certainly what Paul's dealing with in several of his letters.
I should ask my wife, the world history teacher. Maybe she would know.
Yeah, if she knows enough about patriotism, she might not know
but
much.
No, she would probably know about feudalism. So that's where I'm.
Exactly.
She definitely teaches on that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, she's married to a guy that gives her feudalism.
There's a lot of feuding there, yeah.
Yeah. So,
nice.
Feudalism, that's our number one marriage issue there for us. Yeah.
Exactly.
I have a MFT in feudalism.
So in light of this, and especially talking about how Paul's saying this is an issue for Christians, because in order to attach yourself to this patron, that also means you have to attach yourself to their God, and you'll have to participate in the festivals, the cultic practices of those false deities, which is an issue when you are serving the one God of Israel. What do we do with this idleness idea then?
Okay, so let's go read that passage because we didn't do that already. So it's 2 Thessalonians 3, 10 through 12.
Okay. Oh.
And if you have any words that you need help with, let me know.
For even when we were with you, we gave you this command: anyone unwilling to work should not eat. For we hear that some of you are living in idleness, merely busybodies, not doing any work. Now, such persons we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. This sounds so American here.
It does. It does, but that's because we've
the way
taken
we've
out of
read
its
it.
context.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, exactly. What Paul's doing is he's encouraging them to work for their own sustenance instead of depending on the patronage system. And again, the patronage system, you have to now go along with his politics, go along with his conduct, go along with his way of life, and go along with his religion. And also, think of it this way. One of the ways for your political, patron, social, civic guy to get ahead, it usually almost always was a guy, to get ahead was you put down the other candidate as well, right? Mm. You're not just pumping up your person. It's the reason why the other person's bad. Crooked Hillary, for example.
I was going to say, it's amazing how none of this is correlated to modern society.
Yeah. So now if you're involved in that scandal, I'll almost call it, you have to be a busybody. You have to be going around finding out garbage about the other patrons so that you can make yours better. You want the inside scoop to make your person better and theirs worse. And that's what Paul's speaking about. So here's the deal. Paul's contrasting this then with a quiet worker who just feeds themselves by their own labors and their own activities. And he's like, no, don't go doing the work of your patron. Go do the work of God's kingdom and be faithful to the cross.
So we've talked about this before in defining social groups, but there's really no upper class, middle class, lower class as we know it. And middle class that's like an industrial revolution concept in America.
Probably.
I mean, that's where we get the...
Ask your wife. She's
honestly, it is. Yeah,
She might know. Too. Yeah. I meant that seriously.
But this is where the idea of we get even wearing your Sunday best to church is a post-industrial revolution idea where now you get the lower class, the working class, actually doesn't live in poverty all the time. They have good clothes that they could actually wear on Sunday. Like 800 years ago, people weren't wearing their Sunday best to church. They were just wearing what they had. They wear their clothes. And so there isn't a middle class, but like you said, there's that maybe top level of the poor class. Because what do we say before when we talked about socioeconomics? 93% of the Roman world is going to be in poverty. 90? Okay. And so you only have the upper 10% is going to actually have money. But you probably have tiers within your poor in terms of how much someone has.
There are 3 tiers.
Yeah. And so when you're looking at the top of the poor class, let's call that middle class, even though it's not really a middle class. But they're going to be doing better than day laborers who are just totally hand to mouth. And Paul's telling them, though, hey, step backwards. You actually have to give some of this up. That's a huge risk because at what fortunate position are they in just to be able to not be scraping by a homeless person?
Yeah, because again, you know where your next day's food's going to come from because your patron's going to provide it. And it's going to be probably good food, so better than what you get on your own. And you don't have to go work as a garbage man. You don't have to go work as a janitor or a custodian. You don't have to go work as a
bad job.
As a tow truck driver. You don't have those jobs that you resent, that's labor or shoveling rocks or whatever, physically demanding jobs that give you no honor or no prestige. No, you're loafing around town. You're minding people's business, which you shouldn't be. It's a way better lifestyle. Exactly. So Paul's telling them, hey, make it your ambition. Let's go back to chapter 4 of 1 Thessalonians again now. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. And what that means is don't be involved in all these public entanglements. tied to patronage.
Because that's what would happen when you're involved with the patron. You have to associate, if they're getting raw hyped up over something, you have to do that as well in order to support them. So they don't look like the crazy person who's out there causing a ruckus. They have all their minions, we'll call it that, doing their work for them. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. You're leading the rally. It's directly tied to patronage. And then attend to your own business. Go. Instead of stay out of public affairs. Don't worry about the other candidates' positions. Don't worry about the other patrons' positions and trying to undermine them and trying to make yours look better. Just attend to your own business and then work with your hands means get a day labor job. Be a laborer, be an artisan, be a slave laborer if you have to, be a fisherman, be a carpenter, be a custodian. Go find a regular job. But that work was despised by most people, understandably. And so Paul's interest, no, you have to find a way of getting economic independence from these patrons. That's the context. It has nothing to do with, as we've come to read it, of not working at all, being lazy and getting government handouts.
Yeah. So we just have a completely severed way of reading this passage that all we're doing is importing our modern either work ethic or maybe what our political ideology has said this is the way it ought to be, in using a Bible passage and say, see, they're talking about the same thing too.
Exactly. And then what it does is it works really well. And this is where I always go back to the parable of the sower. Oh, surprised I go back there again, Vinnie, because it's about power. It's about power, comfort, security, privilege. And what happens is if I can come up with a theology or an ideology that reinforces and condones and supports my comfort. Wow. Guess what? I'd love to give to that poor homeless person, but Jesus told me not to because he's made bad decisions. I'm reinforcing his bad decisions, and handouts don't do any good, which, by the way, that's not true. They actually do help. All that reinforces I can hold on to my own power, my own comfort, my own privilege, and I can feel good about it.
Now, can we use wisdom, getting into a practical application? We're talking two different things. There's the theology of it, which comes with the oughts. You ought to do it this way. Jesus ordered, whether it's an imperative, Jesus says, do it this way. We're not talking about, or don't do it this way. There's those sorts of things. And what we're saying right now is the text isn't saying what we've thought it to say. It's not demanding people work or they don't get this, or it's not demanding to not give to the poor. I remember the first time I ever heard someone use the passage, was it from Mark 14? It's other places as well. But when the Mary is doing
the poor you'll always have.
Yeah, the poor you'll always have. See, Jesus says there's always going to be a poor there. And I'm like, that doesn't seem right. And then you study the passage and you just realize from the context, what he's saying is you always have the opportunity to take care of the poor. But this is that one opportunity she had to bless the temple. Something else is being said there. He's not saying you will never have. It's the same thing people do. Am I my brother's keeper? See, I'm not my brother's keeper. No, you're reading into that. Like, he doesn't say, no, you're not your brother's keeper. There's a number of things that we read into because we want to, but you look at the context and I don't think he's actually saying what you...
No, and we're going to look at that statement in Mark 14, the poor you'll always have, because actually it's not even saying that. It's saying something even more than that.
Okay.
But we'll have to look at the context on that also, because that's also used to say, see, I don't have to give to the poor.
They're just always going to be there.
There's always going to be there. It won't do any good. And it's like, that's not what Jesus is talking about.
No, he's not saying that at all. Yeah.
Not at all. Yeah.
But here's the question then. We could still use wisdom in how we apply this, in how we give money, in how we take care of people, in which organizations we give to, or how we do things. There's still wisdom there that we could use. It doesn't mean that we just have to go empty our bank accounts. And I have a lot of homeless people where I live out in the Bay Area. Does it mean I'm supposed to just cash out and hand out all my money now?
No, but now I live in Arizona, so it's 108 degrees, 110 degrees today. Yeah. So when I'm driving my car and I see that guy out there begging for money, he's standing in 110 degree heat.
Which is going to feel a lot warmer.
Yeah. Have some bottles of water in your car. Yeah. So you can stop and give it to them. And so now when I was in Bakersfield, they did a wonderful job in the city of Bakersfield. A lot of the churches and other organizations did a fantastic job caring for the poor and the homeless people in the city. And I realized after not being there for long that if you were poor, if you were homeless in Bakersfield, it was probably because of mental health situations where you actually couldn't take care of yourself. In other words, you couldn't take advantage of the public services because of mental health issues. Now, one of the things that people don't realize is that being homeless causes mental health issues. They're not homeless because of mental health. They have mental health issues because they're homeless. Now, part of that then becomes they take drugs to numb their pain. And as we think, you did drugs, you have mental health issues, and that relates to your homelessness, and that may be true.
I think there's definitely those kind of cases.
Yeah, absolutely. But for the most part, we're looking at people that were simply not able to get the care that they needed because they had a shelter in town run by basically churches, that especially for men, and then they open a women's one as well, that basically you go check in there and you make a commitment to stay there, and they will give you all the things that you need, a bed, food, clothing, shelter. They'll help you with jobs. You do work while you're there. They'll help you get a resume together. You find a job, and then eventually you move out. It's a phenomenal program that they have. But if you have drugs and you're not willing to give them up, then you can't check in. They won't let you do it. So the situation was, I can still figure out a way to, hey, let me maybe go buy this person lunch or bring a sandwich with me or have food in my car or whatever. But if I give them money, they're going to use it for drugs. But again, I think I don't want to support that. I don't want to condone that. But oftentimes they're doing drugs to numb their pain. So yeah, you have to use wisdom, and you do this as parents. Do I care for my child right now? My child is an alcoholic. My child is doing this. My child is doing that. My child is, and every time they do that, they come running home to mom and dad. And so where do I draw that line and say, you know what? You're going to have to make this decision on your own, and I'm not going to be your safety net because I think at some point I'm enabling you.
Totally enabling.
All very difficult decisions. In our churches, ones that we found out, and this happened in Livermore and then happened in Bakersfield as well, is Livermore, we had a better system in place. We had a network because the poor would go from church to church, to church. And so we're like, okay, look, here's the deal. We're going to help you out, but here's what we're going to ask you to do. You're going to do this and this. So if you come back to us in 2 months and you need help, we're going to ask, did you do these things? Okay. And we would do that with members of our church in Bakersfield. We would say, okay, you need help with your PG&E. That's great. And no problem at all. And things happen. We understand, and you tell us what happened and why you couldn't. Great. Guess what? We had a deacon's fund. We're going to take care of it. And if you're in our church, you're more likely to get the care. But we're also going to say, if you're not in our church, we want you to come to church for the next couple of weeks. We want to care for your physical needs, but we also want to care for your spiritual needs. And it wasn't like, hey, we're going to burden you with all that. It's just something we want to be there holistically for you. And if you don't do these things, then we might not do them for you the next time you come ask. And it's all that is wisdom. And absolutely. And it's for the person's best interest. But
And sometimes it's not loving them to give them what they're asking for, because like I said, all it's doing is enabling. I'm thinking of this, the first job, the church that you and I worked out together, one of my first responsibilities was overseeing care in our campus. And the first person I had come in to look for benevolence, it wasn't passing the sniff test, and I did some background information, and it's, this person is totally a scammer. And actually, I'm having a flashback on this. I happen to know the sister of this woman, who I went to college with years earlier. And it was just wild where it's, this is someone who's abusing the system and that sort of thing. And I would say there probably is needs for this woman. Like she probably was in serious need, but it's not loving her to give her what she's asking for, because all it's doing is perpetuating the scam life that she was living. She was a scammer basically, and she was doing that in order to perpetuate things. And while she has very real needs, it's not helping her to give her what she needs right now, but she needs something. And that's the problem, though, is we often live in a binary yes or no. We either help her or we don't. And that's where I think we need to do a better job, especially in the church, is looking at a third way of saying, how could we either just say yes or no? Is there something else that we could do? I don't know what the solution to that is, because I think it's complex.
It is.
But the world's way of saying it is to say yes or no. You either qualify or you don't. But how can we continue to love that person even through them being a scammer? Because obviously the scamming is a symptom of something else as well.
So what we'll do in the next couple episodes is look more deeply at causes of poverty, causes of poor, what the church can do, and what the biblical text says in terms of the poverty and the poor and our care for them, and what it looks like for the church. I'm not talking about what it looks like for a country or a nation. And certainly, we can advocate for certain laws. That's great. But we're talking about what it looks like for the church in particular, individually and corporately.
So here's a quote I remember that I'll leave us with, and then we could pick it up next week if we remember.
Okay.
I remember years ago, this is it had to have been like during Obama running for president the first time, so like 2008. And I remember Mike Huckabee, who was governor at the time of Arkansas.
I think so. That sounds right.
And he made a comment saying, if the church, this is surprising coming from a Republican, if the church had done its job in taking care of the poor, the state wouldn't have to. So that could even be part of the conversation. How much of the burden relies on the church, and how much should the state actually be involved in this stuff? Not necessarily from a political standpoint, but even just having that conversation from a church standpoint, saying, how much burden do we have to carry in this sort of thing? I think that would be, if we're going to talk about that, that's one of those things that I would like to engage as well.
Okay, absolutely. Let's do that.
Yeah, but that's it for today. Look at 10 o'clock. We could get on with our mornings and
at night. We've been doing this since 8 a.m.
You guys don't know this. We stay up all night podcasting,
praying
first. Yes.
Yeah, we pray.
Yes.
And we fast and we speak in tongues.
Yes. And then we podcast.
Yes. And then I pull muscles.
Oh yeah. How you doing? Have you recovered,
Thanks
buddy?
for asking. I'm healed. I'm all healed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to lay hands on you, but we're over Zoom.
Yeah. You can try. Touch the screen.
I don't want to ruin my camera.
Yeah. Anyways, no, it was a tough week. I was in a body cast all week.
A body cast. You're in an iron lung.
Immobilized, but I was able to play golf.
Gosh, man.
Anyways, yeah.
You're really giving up the
wrestling
luxuries
with
of life.
crocodiles.
Oh yeah. What do you live in Florida now?
Rattlesnakes out here in Arizona.
Nice.
And coyotes. The coyotes are tough.
They're the worst. All right, everyone.
Yeah.
We'll move on now. See you guys next week. I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.